Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. Today we do Egypt, or at least we do Egypt geography. So we get started. Egypt, where any man can be a pharaoh, or at least a Homer Simpson can be a pharaoh, with his ice cream pyramid. Egypt is in northeastern Africa. It's a corner of northeastern Africa, where Africa meets Asia. It is in Africa, but it's not African. And we can see this in the art. We'll see this in the history. Egypt is connected through the Nile to sub-Saharan Africa, but it doesn't see itself as part of that. Nor is it Mesopotamian. It is its own thing, and in fact, it's considered its own thing. The Greeks will consider it its own thing. The Romans will consider it Egyptos its own thing. It's like its own continent, even though, yes, it's tied, it's in a larger land. It's really separated from other things, and it's the oldest continuous civilization of the ancient world. It had 25 dynasties before the Greeks ever show up. So while there's cities in Mesopotamia, they get wiped out. They get cleaned. They get etch-a-sketched, shaken, and obliterated. You'll have the Assyrians, you'll have the Persians, you'll have different peoples who come through and destroy, take over, change the culture. The same thing is happening in India, and the same thing is happening in China. While urban civilization is about as old in all of these places, the destruction that happens in China and in India means that the culture itself has starts and stops, whereas the Egyptian culture continues at least until the Greek invasion or until the Arabs come in the 600s AD. So, but in the ancient world, the Egyptians are old. Everyone knows they're old. Everyone considers them to be old. Let's just put it this way. We are closer to hanging out with Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to building a pyramid. That's how old Egypt was. Its geography is made up of two parts, the deserts and the Nile. And you can see the deserts on the image. There's deserts in the east and deserts in the west. And that separates them from other people. Those deserts cause isolation. Isolation equals protection. There are no invasions of the earliest old kingdom. For 1,000 years, Egypt exists, no invasions. Because no army can come across those deserts. But it also means there's limited interaction. So they're behind. They won't have the wheel. They don't have horses. They don't create huge cities like Babylon. There is, in fact, if you take a look at the image, there's only really two places where they contact other peoples. In the far north, in the Delta, and at the first cataract. We'll talk about cataracts in a moment. But there's really only two places at the edges of Egypt. So if you lived between those two yellow dots, you could go your entire life and never meet a foreigner. Because there's no reason for foreigners to come into Egypt. They want to trade for food, they trade at these two places, and then they leave. The Nile is the longest river of the ancient world. And it equals life. It equals Egypt. It is Egypt. It is defined from the first cataract to the delta is the Egyptian Nile. And even today you can see where people live. They live right along the Nile. That green ribbon between the two deserts in the left-hand photo is the same as the lights at night in the right-hand photo. So you can see exactly where people live, and they live on the Nile. If there is no Nile, there is no Egypt. Now, the Nile does something unusual. It floods for 3 months every year. And that should be terrible. That's terrible. That's awful. We know flood stories. Gilgamesh, everyone dies. Noah, everyone dies. Mesopotamian flood stories are terrible. Everybody dies in them. So Egypt is underwater for 3 months every year. That should be terrifying. But it's not. Why? Because of that every year part. The floods in Mesopotamia happen. They just happen. No one knows when they're coming. No one can predict them. Secondly, Mesopotamia is in a fishbowl like New Orleans. It is in a valley between two rivers. So when those rivers flood, it fills in that valley, which means that's how you get a Noah story. That's how you get a Gilgamesh story, where the world is flooded. Because if you lived in Mesopotamia, the world was flooded. It's like being a 5-year-old in New Orleans when Katrina hit. If you're a 5-year-old sitting on your roof, everywhere you know is flooded. The entire world is flooded. Your school is flooded. The place you get candy is flooded. Your house is, of course, flooded. Your entire world is flooded. And so it makes total sense that Gilgamesh, that Noah, would wipe out the world in a flood. But in Egypt, there are nice flood stories. The flood is a good thing. The flood is a great thing. It's predictable. It happens. Hell, if it doesn't happen, that's a disaster. And so you can, because it's predictable, you could plan for it. You could prepare for it. Hey, everything's going to be 10 feet underwater. What do? Build 11 feet in the air. You could build dikes. You could build canals. You could direct water. You know it's going to flood, so let's direct water to further fields. Everything close to the river is going to be 10 feet underwater. All right, build 11 feet in the air. What this did was bring up a lot of fertilizer that made the Nile Valley the richest place on earth. Egypt in this class is always going to be rich. It gets 3 to 5 harvests a year. Now that matters because in Mesopotamia, you got one. Maybe if it was a huge, glorious year where the gods didn't slap you around, you got 2. And you did a super dance. In Egypt, 2. 2's a terrible year. They got 3 to 5. A typical American person makes $50,000 a year. Now imagine doing that job. Imagine doing the same job that other people gain $50,000 a year for, and you get paid $150,000. Or in a good year, with a bonus, you get paid $250,000 a year. What do you think about life? You'd think it's great. You'd have a nicer house. You'd have happier kids. You'd buy some education. You'd have less debt. You'd take more travel. You'd have a greater life. And you'd be like, this is awesome. I'm getting paid 3 times more than the person doing the same job. That's awesome. Well, that's Egypt. Egyptians think life is awesome. They think Egypt is awesome. They don't want to leave Egypt. Egypt is awesome. You go to Mesopotamia, it's a mess. There's war, there's disasters, there's flooding. It's a ruin. You go back to Egypt, it's hot in the summer. All right, so what? But otherwise, you're rich, life is good. So their afterlife is good. Their view of the gods are good. Everything about being an Egyptian is good. So what we will talk about next is politics, and we'll start with the Old Kingdom. Thank you.